Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, way back, to the sun-drenched lands of ancient Egypt. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself standing on the banks of the mighty Nile, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant bleating of goats. The sun beats down, a relentless golden hammer on your skin, as you watch farmers toil in fields stretching as far as the eye can see. They're cultivating something vital, something that will become the very staff of life in this incredible civilization. You can almost feel the dry, dusty earth beneath your bare feet. Imagine the rhythmic chant of workers, the creak of wooden tools, all centered around tiny, unassuming grains that will fuel pharaohs and pyramid builders alike. You're about to discover how these people, without modern machinery or even a decent sieve, managed to make bread, a bread so gritty with sand, you probably wouldn't survive a single loaf without a trip to the dentist. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with those humble beginnings of agriculture, with the very first attempts by humans to stop being entirely nomadic hunter-gatherers and instead settle down and coax food from the earth. Long before the pyramids pierced the sky or hieroglyphs adorned temple walls, the people who would become the ancient Egyptians were experimenting with wild grasses. Imagine you're one of them, hundreds of generations ago, stumbling upon fields of what we now call emmer wheat and barley. These weren't the plump, easy-to-thresh varieties you see in modern farms. Oh no, these were tough, wild ancestors, their grains clinging stubbornly to their husks. But even then, there was something undeniably promising about them. You'd notice how they grew in abundance in certain areas, particularly along the fertile ribbons of land near the river. The sheer discovery that you could plant a tiny seed, wait a few months, and then harvest enough food to feed your family for a while must have been revolutionary. This wasn't just a new food source. It was the birth of a new way of life. Suddenly, the endless hunt for sustenance began to shift, making permanent settlements not just possible, but desirable. Historians still argue whether this transition was a sudden eureka moment or a slow, gradual understanding that unfolded over centuries of observation and trial and error. But what's clear is that once the potential of these grains was understood, there was no turning back. These earliest domesticated grains, particularly emmer wheat and barley, became the absolute bedrock of their entire civilization. They were the original economic drivers, the very foundation upon which a complex society would eventually be built. You can almost hear the quiet hum of history, the whisper of ancient winds carrying the promise of a harvest. As you settle deeper into this ancient world, you begin to understand that while the discovery of grains was crucial, their consistent cultivation depended on one magnificent, life-giving force, the Nile River. Imagine standing with the early Egyptians, your eyes fixed on the horizon as the summer months turn into autumn. The river, normally flowing within its banks, begins to swell, slowly, steadily. It rises, overflowing its banks, not in a destructive flood like we often imagine, but in a gentle, benevolent inundation. This wasn't a sudden deluge. It was a gradual, predictable rise, transforming the parched, dusty landscape into a vast, shallow lake. You can almost feel the anticipation in the air. This annual event wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was the very pulse of Egyptian life. As the waters receded after about a month, they left behind something truly miraculous, a fresh, thick layer of black, silty soil. Aki, this wasn't just any dirt. This was a nutrient-rich, perfectly fertilized topsoil, replenished year after year without any need for human intervention or chemical fertilizers. It was a gift from the gods, a direct pipeline of fertility delivered right to their fields. This black soil, or kemet as the Egyptians called it, stood in stark contrast to the barren red desert, Deshret, that surrounded their narrow strip of verdant land. The very name for Egypt, Kemet, came from this black soil. It tells you everything you need to know about its importance. Think about it in many other parts of the world. Early farmers had to contend with soil depletion, moving their fields every few years, or painstakingly enriching the land with animal manure. But not here. The Nile did all the hard work for them, effectively providing a natural, self-renewing agricultural system. This unique geographical advantage is a mainstream historical fact that completely shaped ancient Egyptian society. It allowed for high population densities, the specialization of labor, and ultimately, the creation of a surplus of food that could support monumental projects like the pyramids. You watch as families gather at the edge of the receding waters, their faces alight with hope for the coming season. A quirky tidbit is that the predictability of the Nile's flood was so fundamental to their lives that the ancient Egyptians based their entire calendar around it. They divided their year into three seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. Every aspect of their existence, from religious festivals to administrative tasks, revolved around this hydraulic rhythm. It was a cosmic dance between humanity and nature, with the Nile as the lead dancer. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians fully understood the geological reasons for the Nile's annual flooding, the heavy rains in the Ethiopian highlands, or if they simply viewed it as a divine blessing. Either way, you, as an ancient observer, would certainly view it as pure magic, ensuring the continued bounty of their land and the survival of their people. The gentle lapping of the receding waters is a lullaby, promising sustenance and life. With the Nile's generous gift of fertile soil laid bare, your attention now turns to the sheer physical exertion required to prepare the land for planting. Forget tractors, forget even iron-tipped plows. You're witnessing the primitive plowing methods of ancient Egypt, a testament to raw human and animal power. The fields, once covered by the receding floodwaters, are now a sticky, rich expanse of mud and newly deposited silt. This soil is incredibly fertile. Yes, but it's also heavy, dense, and challenging to work. You see farmers, their bodies glistening with sweat in the morning sun, guiding simple wooden plows. These aren't the intricate, steel-bladed contraptions we know today. No, these are often little more than a sharpened, sometimes fire-hardened, wooden share, essentially a pointed stick, attached to a rudimentary frame. It's a design that hasn't changed much in millennia, a basic tool for scratching the surface of the earth. The plow barely breaks the soil, it more accurately scrapes a shallow furrow, creating just enough disturbance for the seeds to find purchase. You might chuckle, if you weren't so exhausted just watching, at how utterly inefficient it looks by modern standards. It's like trying to dig a garden with a very determined stick. The real power comes from the beasts of burden, oxen. You see them yoked together, their powerful shoulders straining against the wooden crossbar, slowly, ponderously dragging the plow through the thick, yielding earth. The farmers, often one guiding the plow and another urging the oxen forward, walk barefoot through the mud, their feet sinking with each step. It's a rhythmic, almost hypnotic dance of man and beast, punctuated by grunts of effort and the occasional shout to encourage a flagging animal. This backbreaking labor is a mainstream historical fact, the foundation of their agricultural output. It highlights the immense physical cost of food production in the ancient world. A quirky tidbit sometimes, if oxen weren't available, or for smaller plots, humans themselves would pull these plows. Imagine that, strapping yourself to a wooden stick and dragging it through wet, heavy mud, hour after hour, under the Egyptian sun. It puts your morning workout into perspective, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether certain plowing techniques were developed independently in Egypt or borrowed from neighboring cultures. But the sheer persistence of this basic method for thousands of years speaks to its effectiveness. However laborious, you can almost feel the ache in your own back just observing them. The rhythmic squelch of mud underfoot, and the lowing of the oxen echoing across the freshly turned earth. The air, surprisingly, carries the scent of damp earth and exertion, a powerful, earthy perfume. With the fields now laboriously scratched and furrowed, the next crucial step in this ancient cycle of sustenance begins the sowing of the sacred seeds. You watch as the farmers, many of whom were just pushing those primitive plows, now shift to a more delicate, yet equally vital task. They carry woven baskets or pouches filled with the precious emmer wheat and barley kernels, the very promise of the next harvest. You observe their technique, a method unchanged for millennia broadcasting. This isn't the precise, mechanized planting you might envision today. Instead, the farmer walks slowly and deliberately across the prepared field, rhythmically swinging their arm in a wide arc, scattering handfuls of seeds across the damp earth. It's an art form, really, requiring a keen eye and steady hand to ensure an even distribution. Too many seeds in one spot, and they'll compete for nutrients. Too few, and precious arable land goes to waste. You can almost see the tiny seeds arcing through the air, catching the morning light, before softly settling into the freshly tilled soil. There's a quiet reverence in their movements. These aren't just inanimate objects. These are the future of their families, their villages, their entire civilization. They are literally sowing the seeds of their survival. The act of scattering grain, hoping for a bountiful harvest, is a mainstream historical fact that resonates through countless ancient cultures. It's a testament to humanity's enduring hope and reliance on the land. After the seeds are scattered, another layer of work begins. Sometimes small flocks of sheep or goats are driven across the fields, their hooves gently pressing the seeds into the soft mud, offering a rudimentary form of harrowing. Other times, farmers might drag branches or light plows over the surface to achieve a similar effect, ensuring the seeds are covered and protected from hungry birds or strong winds. You might see a flock of birds, ever opportunistic, swooping down, hoping to snatch an easy meal before the seeds are adequately covered. The farmer might shout, wave their arms, or even send a child to scare them off. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Egyptian tomb paintings depict not just the sowing, but also the vigilant bird scaring that followed, underscoring this constant battle against nature's smaller, winged predators. Historians still argue whether specific rituals or blessings accompanied the sowing process, beyond the general prayers to the gods for a good harvest, but the palpable sense of hope and vulnerability in the air is undeniable. You can almost feel the quiet prayer in each toss of the hand, a silent plea to Osiris, the god of agriculture and the afterlife, for the seeds to germinate, for the sun to shine, and for the Nile to provide its next life-giving flood. The scent of damp earth and the subtle, earthy aroma of the seeds themselves fill the air, as the promise of the coming year is literally sown into the ground beneath your feet. With the seeds now nestled in the fertile mud, the farmer's focus shifts to the delicate, yet absolutely critical, phase of irrigation ingenuity. Even with the Nile's generous annual flood, the vast majority of the growing season, Pere, was dry. The sun, while vital for photosynthesis, could also quickly bake the soil hard and wither young shoots if they didn't receive continuous moisture. So, you witness how the ancient Egyptians, masters of water management, coaxed life from their fields. You see a network of ingeniously designed, though seemingly simple, canals and ditches. These aren't grand, straight lines like modern irrigation channels. They're often meandering, following the natural contours of the land, designed to capture and distribute every precious drop of water. After the floodwaters receded, small dams or dikes, often made of mud, were constructed to hold residual water in basins, allowing it to slowly seep into the soil. For fields further from the river or higher up, human effort became paramount. Imagine the backbreaking work of raising water. You might see individuals or groups operating the chaudouffon, a common, hand-operated water lifting device. This simple machine consists of a long pole pivoted on a horizontal support, with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. You watch as a farmer rhythmically dips the bucket into a water source, perhaps a small canal or a natural pool. Then, using the counterweight, swings it up and tips the water into a higher level ditch. It's a slow, repetitive, almost meditative process, hour after hour, under the intense sun, each bucketful a lifeline to the thirsty plants. This dedication to water management is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing their profound understanding of their environment. For larger fields, you might observe a group of workers using baskets to manually scoop water from a lower channel and empty it into a higher one. It's an endless chain of human endeavor, moving water inch by painstaking inch across the landscape. The sheer human investment in keeping these fields watered is staggering, a constant struggle against dehydration and crop failure. You appreciate the cleverness of using the Nile's natural flow and then supplementing it with these ingenious, if arduous, methods. A quirky tidbit sometimes. Farmers would deliberately crack open the mud walls of their basin fields to drain water into lower fields, creating a cascade effect. This showed a sophisticated understanding of gravity and water flow, maximizing the use of every drop. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these irrigation systems implied a centralized, top-down management from early pharaohs, or if they evolved more organically from community cooperation at a local level. Regardless, you can feel the vital connection between these intricate ditches and the vibrant green shoots emerging from the soil. The gentle gurgle of water moving through the channels is the sound of life itself, promising a future harvest. Months have passed since the tiny seeds were sown and painstakingly watered. And now, the fields, once emerald green, have transformed into a shimmering sea of gold under the relentless Egyptian sun. This signals the arrival of Shemu, the harvest season, and with it, the arduous task of reaping ripe grain. You stand among the mature stalks of emmer wheat and barley, tall and heavy with their precious kernels, ready to be gathered. The scene before you is one of tireless, communal effort. Entire families, sometimes even whole villages, would participate in the harvest. There are no combine harvesters here, no massive machines that chew through acres in a day. Instead, you see workers, mostly men, but often women and children too, armed with simple sickles. These aren't the broad, sweeping scythe you might see in European harvest depictions. These are smaller, curved blades, often made of flint or chert set into a wooden handle, sometimes even bronze for the wealthier farmers. Each swing is deliberate, cutting the stalks just below the heads, gathering them into manageable bundles. It's a rhythmic, back-breaking motion, repeated thousands upon thousands of times under the blazing sun. You can almost hear the soft, insistent swish of the sickles cutting through the dry stalks, punctuated by the occasional snap of a particularly stubborn stem. Dust, fine and golden, rises with every movement, coating everything and everyone in a uniform layer. The work is relentless, starting at dawn and continuing until dusk, often with only short breaks for water and a quick meal. This intense physical labor and the use of primitive tools for harvesting are mainstream historical facts, highlighting the immense human cost of securing food in the ancient world. You might see a supervisor, perhaps a foreman or an overseer, watching the process, ensuring the work is done thoroughly and efficiently. It's a crucial period, as a poor harvest could spell disaster for the entire community. A quirky tidbit that might make you wince while cutting the stalks. Workers would inevitably pick up small stones and bits of dirt mixed in with the grain. Sometimes, even tiny insects or mice nests would be swept up, adding to the delightful mix that would eventually become their daily bread. You wonder, perhaps with a slight shiver, about the hygiene standards of the time. Historians still argue whether different regions of Egypt developed slightly varied sickle designs or if there was a standardized tool across the entire kingdom. But what's certain is the collective sigh of relief that would ripple through the community as the last sheaf was cut, signifying the successful completion of another vital harvest. The air is thick with dust and the dry, grassy scent of newly cut grain, a smell that speaks of hard work and, hopefully, a full belly. With the golden stalks painstakingly reaped, the next critical phase in the ancient Egyptian bread-making journey begins, threshing the golden grains. You follow the bundles of cut wheat and barley as they are transported from the fields to specially prepared threshing floors. These are typically flat, circular areas, often hardened with clay or compacted earth, sometimes even paved with stone to provide a firm surface. This isn't just a casual dumping ground. It's a dedicated workspace designed to separate the valuable grain from the less desirable parts of the plant. You observe the primary method of threshing, a remarkably simple yet effective technique that relies on animal power. Herds of cattle, donkeys, or even sheep are driven repeatedly over the piled-up grain stalks. Their hooves, strong and numerous, tirelessly trample and crush the brittle husks, breaking open the ears and releasing the precious kernels. The animals move in a slow, continuous circle, their rhythmic plodding creating a dusty, almost hypnotic scene. The air quickly becomes thick with dust, fine chaff, and tiny fragments of straw, a hazy golden cloud illuminated by the sun. You instinctively want to cover your mouth and nose. This is a truly dusty and tireless process. A mainstream historical fact of ancient agriculture. Farmer, often armed with long poles or forks, constantly turn and rearrange the straw piles, ensuring that all the grain receives adequate trampling. It's a continuous, arduous dance between man and beast, designed to liberate every last kernel. The lowing of the animals, the shouts of the herders, and the relentless rustle of crushed straw fill the air. It's a primal scene, deeply connected to the earth and the rhythm of the seasons. You might notice that, despite the care taken, small stones and bits of grit from the threshing floor inevitably become mixed in with the grain. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, this dust and grit is just another charming addition to their daily lives. A quirky tidbit is that in some depictions, especially in tomb paintings, you can see not just the animals, but also human workers using flails, long sticks with a shorter, hinged stick at the end, to beat the grain manually. This would have been particularly common for smaller quantities or for cleaning up after the animals. Historians still argue whether different animal species were preferred for threshing based on grain type or regional availability. But the overwhelming impression is one of sheer, unremitting effort, all directed towards coaxing the sustenance from the plant. The smell of dry straw, animal sweat, and fine dust is pervasive, a scent that tells you exactly how hard these people work for their daily bread. After the dusty, energetic chaos of threshing, the grain and chaff are now a messy, mixed pile. The next step, crucial for separating the valuable kernels from the unwanted debris, is winnowing the wheat. You move from the threshing floor to an adjacent area, often a slightly elevated spot where the breeze can be harnessed. This is where the magic of ancient aerodynamics, however rudimentary, comes into play. You watch as workers, typically women, take large scoop-like baskets or shallow wooden trays, often referred to as winnowing fans. They fill these baskets with the threshed mixture of grain, broken straw, and light chaff. With a practiced, graceful motion, they toss the contents high into the air. It's a rhythmic, almost dance-like movement, repeated again and again. As the mixture arcs through the air, the heavier grain, denser and more substantial, falls relatively straight down, landing on a clean mat or cloth spread out on the ground below. The lighter chaff and straw, however, are caught by the wind, carried away, and deposited a short distance off to the side. It's a surprisingly effective technique, relying entirely on the principle of differential air resistance. The gentle breeze, or sometimes a manually created draft if the wind is still, acts as a natural separator. You can almost hear the soft rustle of the lighter particles being carried away, a subtle counterpoint to the gentle thud of the grain landing. This ingenious method of using wind to separate grain from lighter debris is a mainstream historical fact. found in various forms across many ancient agricultural societies. It's a testament to their keen observation of natural forces and their ability to adapt them to their needs. Despite the elegance of the process, it's far from perfect. While most of the light chaff is removed, tiny bits of grit, small stones, and heavier pieces of dirt that have similar aerodynamic properties to the grain inevitably fall with it. This adds another layer of unavoidable contamination to the mix. You might see the occasional small pebble bounce off the mat, a rogue element in the otherwise golden cascade. A quirky tidbit sometimes. To increase the efficiency, workers might stand on small platforms or mounds to get more height for their tosses, allowing the wind more time to work its magic. This also made the job slightly less backbreaking by reducing the need to stoop. Historians still argue whether the design of winnowing baskets evolved over time for greater efficiency or if their basic form remained largely unchanged for millennia. Regardless, you witness a fundamental step that, while ingenious, still leaves the grain far from clean by modern standards, quietly setting the stage for the gritty reality of ancient Egyptian bread. The air around you, while clearer than the threshing floor, still carries the faint, dry scent of dust and a sense of accomplished labor. With the winnowing complete, the next vital step is ensuring the hard-won grain is safe from spoilage and pests. You are now observing the ingenious methods of storing the sacred staple, the ancient Egyptian granaries. These weren't just simple sheds. They were carefully designed structures, crucial for protecting the precious bounty that fueled their civilization. You see different forms of granaries, each designed with practicality in mind. The most common and enduring type you encounter is the beehive-shaped granary. Imagine tall, tapering structures, often constructed from mud brick, with a small opening near the top for pouring in the grain. At the bottom, a smaller opening or door would allow for retrieval when needed. These structures often clustered together in agricultural centers or within individual estates. Look almost like giant clay pots or silos rising from the earth. Their rounded shape wasn't just aesthetic, it helped to distribute pressure evenly and discourage pests from burrowing into corners. The engineering behind these simple structures is surprisingly sophisticated. They were designed to keep the grain dry, cool, and protected from rodents and insects. The thick mud brick walls provided excellent insulation against the scorching heat of the day, helping to maintain a relatively stable temperature inside. You might notice small ramps or steps leading up to the top opening, making it easier for workers to climb up and empty baskets of grain into the storage. This careful, systematic approach to protecting precious grain from pests and decay is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to their long-term food security. You can almost feel the dry, cool air inside these structures as you imagine them filled to the brim with golden kernels. The quiet hum of their presence speaks volumes about the value of what they held. Imagine the satisfaction of looking upon these full granaries after a successful harvest, knowing that the community would be fed through the lean months. A quirky tidbit: some granaries had raised floors, sometimes built on stone foundations, to prevent dampness from rising from the ground and spoiling the grain from below. This also made it harder for rodents to burrow in directly. Historians still argue whether the concept of centralized state granaries, controlled by the pharaoh or temples, emerged early in Egyptian history, or if local storage by individual farmers was the primary method for a significant period. What's undeniable, however, is the paramount importance placed on secure storage. Without it, all the effort of farming would be for naught. The subtle, dry, and slightly sweet smell of stored grain, a scent of sustenance and survival, permeates the air around these vital structures. Having followed the grain from seed to secure storage, you now gain a deeper appreciation for its profound significance. In ancient Egypt, grain's central role extended far beyond simply being food. It functioned as both currency and a primary food source, the very lifeblood of their economy and society. Imagine a world where your daily bread literally is your money, where your wages aren't paid in coins, but in bushels of wheat or barley. This was the reality for the vast majority of ancient Egyptians. Workers, from the humblest farmer to the skilled artisan, carving intricate reliefs, were often compensated in grain rations. You see laborers queuing up, receiving their allotted measures of grain at the end of a long workday. It's not just a salary, it's the direct means to feed themselves and their families. This system, where grain functioned as a de facto currency, is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the unique economic structure of ancient Egypt. There were no banks in the modern sense. Your wealth was often measured by the amount of grain you possessed or had stored. Think about it: if you wanted to buy a new tool or trade for some linen, you'd likely do so by exchanging a certain quantity of grain. It was the universal medium of exchange, the benchmark against which almost everything else was valued. The stability of the grain supply, therefore, was paramount. A good harvest meant prosperity and peace. A poor harvest could lead to famine, social unrest, and even the downfall of rulers. You feel the weight of this dependency, the constant anxiety tied to the success of the crops. A quirky tidbit is that specific units of grain, like the car, roughly 23 of a bushel, and the hecate, about 4.5 liters, were meticulously used for calculations in administrative documents, contracts, and even legal disputes. These weren't just estimates, they were precise measurements, demonstrating a sophisticated system of accounting. You might see scribes meticulously recording transactions, their papyrus scrolls filled with columns of grain quantities. Historians still argue whether this grain-based economy led to greater equality or entrenched social hierarchies, as the pharaoh and temples amassed enormous stores. But what's clear is that grain was power, stability, and survival, all rolled into one. The very air seems to hum with the vital importance of this golden staple, a quiet omnipresence shaping every aspect of their lives. With the grain securely stored, the focus shifts from the grand agricultural cycle to the more intimate, yet equally laborious, process of transforming raw kernels into the staff of life flour. You are now about to witness milling's first steps, encountering the primitive saddle querns that were the workhorses of ancient Egyptian kitchens and bakeries. This is where the inevitable introduction of grit truly begins. Imagine a simple setup: a large, often slightly concave, lower stone, the saddle, laid on the ground or a low stand. This stone is usually made of a hard, abrasive material like basalt or granite. Above it, you see a smaller, oblong-shaped upper stone, perfectly sized to be gripped by two hands. This is the rubber. These two stones, seemingly unremarkable, are the heart of all grain processing for millennia. You watch as a worker, usually a woman, kneels before the quern, often for hours on end. She places a small handful of winnowed grain onto the concave surface of the saddlestone. Then, gripping the upper stone with both hands, she begins a rhythmic, back-and-forth motion, grinding the kernels against the lower stone. It's a strenuous, repetitive action. The grain is crushed and abraded between the two rough surfaces, slowly, painstakingly, breaking down into a coarse flour. The sound is a constant, grating, scrunch, 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 a sound that must have been the soundtrack to daily life in ancient Egypt. This use of saddle querns for grinding grain is a mainstream historical fact, present in almost every early civilization. As the grinding progresses, tiny fragments of the abrasive stones themselves are inevitably chipped away and mixed in with the flour. Think of it like a very, very slow-motion sandpapering of rock. Combine this with the fine dust and minute sand particles that were still clinging to the grain even after winnowing, and you begin to understand why ancient Egyptian bread was notoriously gritty. The floor around the quern, and indeed the grinder herself, quickly becomes coated in a fine, dusty powder, a mixture of flour, chaff, and pulverized stone. A quirky tidbit: the kneeling position and repetitive motion of using a saddle quern often led to distinctive skeletal changes in women, particularly arthritis in the knees and lower back, a grim testament to the physical toll of daily bread production. You might notice the strained expressions on the faces of those grinding, the sheer, unrelenting effort. Historians still argue whether different types of stone were intentionally selected for querns based on their specific abrasive qualities or simply on local availability. But what's certain is that this pivotal moment, the grinding of grain, marked the irreversible inclusion of sand, shaping not just their bread, but their very teeth. The air is thick with the dry scent of raw grain and the subtle, sharp tang of pulverized rock. As you witness the arduous process of milling, a crucial realization dawns upon you: the sourcing of sand into the ancient Egyptian diet wasn't a deliberate ingredient, but an utterly unavoidable contaminant. From the moment the seeds were sown until the flour was ground, sand was an omnipresent, insidious intruder. You might chuckle, a little darkly, thinking that sandwich takes on a whole new meaning here. Let's trace its path. Shall we remember the fertile Nile silt? While wonderful for growth, it was still essentially river sediment, carrying with it microscopic particles of sand and grit. When the fields were prepared, the plows, whether pulled by oxen or humans, churned up this soil. As the new shoots grew, they were constantly exposed to wind-blown sand from the vast deserts bordering the narrow agricultural strip. Every gust carried fine, abrasive particles, settling on the plants. You can almost feel the dry, fine sand being whipped around, getting into everything. Then came the harvest. Sickles, dragged through the lower parts of the stalks, inevitably scooped up small pebbles and dirt clods from the field floor. During threshing, as animals trampled the grain on hardened earth floors, tiny fragments of the ground itself, along with more wind-blown sand, mixed with the kernels. And don't forget the winnowing process. While it removed lighter chaff, heavier sand particles, similar in density to the grain, simply fell with it. It was a constant, microscopic siege. This consistent, inevitable sand contamination, occurring during every step of the grain process, is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly impacted the health of ancient Egyptians. The final, and perhaps most significant, entry point for sand was the milling itself. As you saw, the saddle querns, made from rough stones like basalt or granite, weren't perfect. As the hard grain was rubbed against these equally hard stones, tiny fragments of the quern itself were abraded off and mixed directly into the flour. Imagine literally grinding your tools into your food. This added a layer of abrasive grit that was impossible to remove. A quirky tidbit is that some researchers have even identified microscopic desert sand particles in the dental calculus hardened plaque of ancient Egyptian mummies, definitively linking the environmental dust to their oral health issues. It wasn't just dirt from the fields, it was the very essence of their desert environment making its way into their bodies. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians were even aware of the extent of this contamination, or if they simply accepted gritty bread as a natural part of life, much like we accept the occasional hair in our takeout, hopefully not too often. You feel a growing sense of the quiet, unseen battle waged by their bodies against this daily onslaught of abrasive particles. Having observed the omnipresent sand, let's zoom in on the primary culprit for its final, most damaging inclusion: the saddle quern's design. You've seen it in action, but now let's really examine the simple yet brutally effective design of this tool, responsible for that characteristic gritty texture that would define ancient Egyptian bread. Imagine the two components: the stationary lower stone, often resembling a saddle, hence the name, and the mobile upper stone, which you saw the women manipulate. The lower stone typically sloped gently upwards at one end, forming a shallow trough. This wasn't just for aesthetics. It helped to keep the grain from spilling off the sides as it was being ground. The surface of both stones, crucially, was intentionally rough, often pecked or scored to create a coarse texture that would effectively abrade the grain. You can almost feel the jaggedness if you were to run your hand over it. This rough surface, combined with the material itself, was the key to its grinding power, and simultaneously, its downfall. The upper stone, the rubber, or muller, was designed to fit comfortably in the hands, allowing for the back and forth rhythmic motion. Its underside was also roughened, ensuring maximum friction against the lower stone. As you watch the grinding, you realize the fundamental flaw from a modern perspective. Anyway, it's stone on stone, with grain caught in between. There's no separation of the grinding surface from the food. As the grain is crushed, the friction inevitably causes tiny particles of both the lower and upper stones to flake off. These aren't large chunks, but microscopic fragments, indistinguishable from the flour itself to the naked eye. This simple yet effective design, which directly introduced stone fragments into the flour, is a mainstream historical fact of early milling. Consider the material. Basalt, granite, or quartzite were common choices for querns because of their hardness and abrasive qualities. These are igneous rocks, formed from volcanic activity, known for their toughness. But toughness also means that when they do abrade, the fragments are incredibly hard and sharp. It's like having tiny shards of glass mixed into your breakfast. A quirky tidbit to maintain their efficiency. These querns needed regular dressing or repecking. As the surfaces wore smooth from constant use, they would be re-roughened using a harder, pointed stone, a process that itself would create more stone dust. You might hear the faint tap, tap, tap of someone redressing their quern in the distance. Historians still argue whether some form of early sieving or sifting, beyond simple winnowing, was occasionally employed to remove larger impurities, though it seems highly unlikely to have removed the fine, almost flour-sized stone particles. This ubiquitous, simple yet brutally effective saddle quern was not just a tool for making food. It was inadvertently a dental hazard in every home. The very essence of ancient Egyptian grit was born here. Having seen the ingenious yet flawed design of the saddle quern, you now truly grasp the immense physical toll exacted by the grinding gauntlet. This wasn't a quick task. It was an unending, arduous chore that dominated the lives of those performing it, primarily women. Imagine yourself in their position, kneeling day after day, year after year before that rough stone. The act of grinding is deceptively simple but incredibly demanding. You grip the heavy upper stone, probably weighing several pounds, and with both hands, your arms ache from the constant back and forth motion, pushing and pulling it across the lower saddle stone. Your shoulders burn, your back stiffens from the continuous stooping, and your knees, unprotected on the hard ground, must suffer terribly. It's a rhythmic, almost hypnotic motion, but one that is utterly exhausting and relentless. The muscles in your forearms and shoulders would be perpetually sore, a testament to the daily struggle for sustenance. You can almost hear the steady shh of the stone on stone, interspersed with sighs of effort, dust, a mix of flour, chaff, and abrasive stone particles, constantly rises, coating your hair, clothes, and skin. You breathe it in, a gritty film settling in your throat and lungs. Your eyes, too, would sting from the fine particles suspended in the air. This immense effort required to hand-grind grain into flour, day after day, is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the sheer physical labor involved in basic food preparation in the ancient world. It makes you deeply appreciate the convenience of a modern mill or even pre-ground flour. Consider the quantity. A single family would need a significant amount of flour daily to make their bread. To produce enough, a woman might spend several hours a day at the quern. For a larger household or a bakery, the work would be ceaseless, with multiple people grinding simultaneously. It wasn't just physical strength, it was an endurance test, a battle of attrition against the unyielding grain and stone. A quirky tidbit sometime to alleviate the strain, women would work in pairs, pushing the upper stone back and forth between them, sharing the burden. You might see them chatting quietly, perhaps gossiping, as they perform this endless task, finding small moments of human connection amidst the monotony. Historians still argue whether the grinding was seen purely as a domestic chore, or if, in some contexts, it attained a more respected, specialized role, given its absolute necessity. But the image of constant, diligent effort punctuated by the dull grind of stone, leaves no doubt about the sheer human commitment involved in producing ancient Egyptian bread. The very air seems to hum with the persistent labor, smelling of dry grain and the fine dust of pulverized stone. After the relentless, grinding gauntlet you've just witnessed, the end result is something that might surprise your modern sensibilities flour that is inherently, undeniably gritty. This isn't the finely sifted, pristine white flour you find in supermarkets today. No, this is coarse, uneven, and crucially, laden with an inescapable amount of sand and pulverized stone. You followed the journey from the Nile's silt to the field, through threshing and winnowing, and finally into the quern. Now, you understand why, despite their best efforts, sand remained an unavoidable component of the flour. Imagine running your fingers through a pile of this ancient flour. It wouldn't feel like a soft, silky powder. Instead, you'd feel a distinct, almost abrasive texture, like fine sand mixed with powder. Tiny, sharp fragments of basalt or granite from the quernstones are now inextricably bound with the pulverized grain. These are not large chunks that could be easily picked out. They are microscopic, insidious particles, thoroughly integrated into the flour. This inherent grittiness, directly resulting from their milling methods, is a mainstream historical fact, perhaps the most defining characteristic of ancient Egyptian bread. The Egyptians, bless their hearts, probably did what they could. They might have tried rudimentary sieving with woven plant fibers or coarse cloth to remove larger pieces of chaff or pebbles that somehow made it through. But removing the truly fine sand and stone particles would have been impossible with their technology. It would be like trying to filter fog with a colander. The very nature of the grinding process guaranteed that some amount of abrasive material would become part of the flour. A quirky tidbit that might make you wince even more: the coarser the flour, the more nutrition it often retained from the whole grain, including the bran and germ. So, while healthier in some respects, it also meant more of the hard, abrasive particles were present. It was a trade-off they didn't even know they were making. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians even perceived this grittiness as a flaw, or if it was simply the accepted, normal texture of bread. For them, it was likely just bread. But for your modern palate, it would be a shocking revelation, a constant, low-level assault on your teeth with every bite. The air, even now, seems to carry the ghost of that gritty texture, a subtle, dry sensation on your tongue. With the flour now ground, coarse and gritty as it may be, the next ingredient essential for transforming it into dough enters the picture: water's life-giving role. And in ancient Egypt, that water almost invariably came from the lifeblood of their civilization, the Nile River. You watch as the gritty flour is brought to a large mixing bowl or a designated area, perhaps a hollowed-out stone basin or a sturdy wooden trough. Then, slowly and carefully, water is added. This isn't just any water. This is Nile water, drawn directly from the river or from one of the many irrigation channels fed by the river. It's teeming with microscopic life, and yes, even more fine silt and minerals carried by the river's flow. While relatively fresh, it certainly isn't purified or filtered to modern standards. You might notice the slight cloudiness, the faint earthy smell of the river itself, as it's poured into the flour. The act of mixing is often done by hand, a primal connection between the baker and their medium. Hands plunge into the dry, coarse flour, gradually incorporating the water, feeling the transformation from a dusty powder to a cohesive, sticky mass. It's a sensory experience: the cool water meeting the dry flour, the changing texture, the growing resistance as the dough begins to form. This mixing of Nile water with the gritty flour to create a dough is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to every loaf of bread baked in ancient Egypt. It's a simple, universal step, yet entirely dependent on their unique environment. As the water is worked in, the gluten in the wheat begins to develop, giving the dough its elasticity and structure. This is where the magic happens, where the lifeless powder starts to become something capable of rising and holding its shape. But even here, the Nile adds its own tiny, subtle contribution to the grittiness. While most larger particles would have settled, the finest silt would remain suspended in the water, adding another microscopic layer of abrasive material to the mix. It's a cycle of natural contamination that seems to have no end. A quirky tidbit sometimes. In addition to water, ancient Egyptians might have added a little milk or even beer, which we'll get to later, to their bread dough for flavor or richness, particularly for special loaves. These additions would have altered the texture and fermentation process in interesting ways. Historians still argue whether the quality and consistency of Nile water, varying with the seasons, had a noticeable impact on the daily bread's taste and texture throughout the year. But the fundamental truth remains: without the Nile's water, there would be no bread, and certainly no ancient Egyptian civilization as we know it. The gentle slosh of the water as it's poured, the soft squelch as it's worked into the flour, are the sounds of life taking shape. With the gritty flour now moistened by the Nile's lifeblood, a truly magical transformation begins, one that the ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand but keenly observed. Leavening's accidental discovery. You watch as the newly mixed dough, left for a short while, starts to undergo a subtle but profound change. Tiny bubbles begin to appear on its surface, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dough seems to swell, to grow in volume. This wasn't a planned scientific experiment. It was a happy accident, repeated countless times in countless kitchens across the ancient world. Imagine leaving a batch of dough out in the warm Egyptian air, perhaps overnight, or even for just a few hours. The airborne yeasts, ever present in their environment, would settle on the dough. The conditions, warmth, moisture, and the sugars in the grain were perfect for these microscopic organisms to thrive. As they ate the sugars, they produced carbon dioxide gas, which became trapped within the elastic network of the dough, causing it to puff up and become light and airy. This natural fermentation process, leading to the first leavened breads, is a mainstream historical fact, a pivotal moment in culinary history. You can almost smell the faint, tangy aroma of fermentation beginning to develop, a scent that signals life and activity within the dough. It's a completely different smell from the dry grain or the damp earth. It's a living, breathing aroma. The Egyptians noticed that this risen dough produced a much lighter, more palatable bread than the flat, unleavened bread they had made before. It was a revelation they didn't know about yeast or carbon dioxide. They simply knew that leaving the dough for a bit produced a better result. A quirky tidbit to ensure a consistent rise. Ancient Egyptian bakers would often save a small piece of fermented dough from one day's baking to use as a starter or leaven for the next day's batch. This was a proto-sourdough starter, passed down from generation to generation, ensuring continuity of their bread's unique flavor and texture. This practice, often referred to as using a barm or sponge, meant that their bread often had a slightly sour tang, much like modern sourdough. Historians still argue whether this accidental discovery of leavening occurred independently in different parts of the ancient world, or if it spread from one innovation hub. But for the Egyptians, it was a divine secret, a gift from the gods that transformed their daily staple. You sense the warmth, the subtle bubbling, and the quiet magic as the dough truly begins to come alive. The magic of leavening, while accidental, relies entirely on an unseen army. Wild yeast's hidden power. You've observed the dough beginning its subtle expansion, but let's peer deeper into the microscopic world responsible for this incredible transformation. The ancient Egyptians didn't understand microbiology, of course, but their environment was teeming with the very organisms that would make their bread rise. Imagine the air in ancient Egypt. It wasn't sterile, it was full of life. Microscopic spores of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the common baker's yeast, floated invisibly on every breeze. These tiny, single-celled fungi were everywhere on the surfaces of grain, on the hands of the bakers, clinging to the walls of the bakery, and certainly in the very air itself. When the dough was mixed, a warm, moist, nutrient-rich environment. These ubiquitous wild yeasts found their perfect home. As soon as these airborne yeasts landed on the dough, they began to feast on the natural sugars present in the ground, emmer wheat and barley. Their metabolic process, the very act of consuming these sugars, produces two key byproducts: alcohol, which mostly evaporates during baking, and, crucially for bread, carbon dioxide gas. Counterform, this gas, trapped within the elastic network of the dough's gluten, creates those tiny bubbles that cause the dough to expand and become light. Without these unseen workers, their bread would remain flat and dense, more like a hardtack cracker than a fluffy loaf. This omnipresence of wild yeasts and their role in initiating the dough's rise is a mainstream historical fact, foundational to all early leavened bread. You can almost feel the gentle hum of unseen biological activity, the silent, tireless work of millions of microscopic organisms. It's a marvel of natural chemistry. The warmth of the Egyptian climate was also a significant factor, providing the ideal temperature for these yeasts to thrive and multiply rapidly. This natural incubator effect helped ensure that leavening was a consistent, if mysterious, phenomenon. A quirky tidbit: ancient Egyptians also brewed a form of beer, and the yeasts used for brewing would have been very similar, if not identical, to those responsible for bread leavening. In fact, the two processes were so intertwined that yeast from beer production could easily be used to kickstart a batch of bread, and vice versa. You might even imagine a baker dipping a cup into a vat of fermenting beer to gather some particularly active yeast for their dough. Historians still argue whether specific strains of wild yeast became dominant in certain bakeries, perhaps giving regional breads distinct flavors, much like modern sourdough cultures. But the sheer power of this invisible biological force, making bread lighter and more digestible, was a constant, if unexplained, blessing. The air around the dough, even now, carries the faint, sweet-sour scent of fermentation, a testament to nature's quiet alchemy. With the dough now alive with wild yeasts, the next step is to prepare it for baking, a process that involves the dough preparation rituals. You are now privy to a common scene in ancient Egyptian households and bakeries: the rhythmic kneading of the dough, often a communal and noisy activity, filling the air with the sounds of effort and perhaps even camaraderie. Imagine large quantities of that coarse, gritty dough, sometimes spread out on a clean mat on the floor, or placed in enormous kneading troughs made of wood or stone. You see individuals, often women, plunging their hands into the sticky mass, pushing, pulling, and folding it with practiced movements. Kneading isn't just about mixing, it's about developing the gluten, the protein network within the flour that gives bread its structure and elasticity. The more the dough is worked, the stronger and more extensible this network becomes, allowing it to trap the carbon dioxide gas produced by the yeast and create a light, airy crumb. This rhythmic kneading of dough, vital for proper bread structure, is a mainstream historical fact, a technique passed down through countless generations. The sound of kneading is distinctive, a soft squelch as hands plunge into the dough, followed by the satisfying thwack as it's folded and slammed back down. When multiple people are kneading, perhaps in a large bakery, the sounds would combine into a rhythmic chorus of effort. You might even hear singing or chanting as a way to synchronize movements and make the monotonous work feel less burdensome. There's a powerful, almost primal connection to the food being created, a tangible sense of labor going directly into sustenance. Despite all this effort, remember the sand. Even with vigorous kneading, those fine, abrasive particles of stone and environmental grit remain stubbornly embedded within the dough. Each fold, each push, simply integrated them more thoroughly, ensuring that every bite of the finished bread would carry its own unique crunch. You can almost feel the slight resistance, the subtle grating sensation, if you were to knead this dough yourself. A quirky tidbit: ancient Egyptian tomb paintings sometimes depict groups of men kneading dough with their bare feet. Especially for very large quantities, destined for communal consumption or temple offerings. While perhaps not the most appetizing image for modern sensibilities, it was an efficient way to apply significant force. Historians still argue whether different regions had unique kneading techniques or if the method was fairly standardized throughout the kingdom. But the sheer physical exertion involved and the communal nature of the task paint a vivid picture of bread making as a fundamental, labor-intensive ritual of daily life. The air, now filled with the earthy scent of raw dough and the subtle tang of fermentation, vibrates with the energy of creation. After the diligent kneading, the dough, now elastic and alive with fermentation, is ready for its transformation into individual loaves. You are now observing the shaping of the humble loaf, witnessing the various forms and sizes of bread that were common in ancient Egypt, from simple discs to more elaborate shapes, each with its own purpose. Imagine the baker's hands dusted with that coarse, gritty flour, skillfully dividing the large mass of dough into smaller, manageable portions. The most basic and common shape you'd see is a simple, round, flat disc, similar to a modern pita or flatbread, but thicker. These would be the everyday loaves, the fundamental sustenance for the working classes. They were easy to make, cooked quickly, and efficient for mass production. You can almost feel the springiness of the well-kneaded dough as it's formed into these simple rounds, perhaps gently patted into shape on a flat surface. This basic shaping of bread into functional forms is a mainstream historical fact across all early civilizations. However, not all bread was created equal. For wealthier household, temple offerings, or special occasions, you might witness the creation of more intricate shapes. Some loaves might be conical, reminiscent of small pyramids or beehives. Others could be molded into animal figures, like fish or birds, perhaps for specific religious rituals or as offerings to the gods. There were also braided loaves, or those adorned with simple patterns pressed into the surface before baking. These more decorative loaves would have required a higher level of skill and more time, indicating their special status. A quirky tidbit: some tomb paintings depict bread molds made of clay, suggesting that certain shapes, particularly the conical ones, were baked within these molds to maintain their form. This allowed for more consistent sizing and potentially a better rise. You might see a baker carefully pressing dough into such a mold before placing it into the oven. Historians still argue whether the elaborate shapes found in tomb depictions were accurate representations of daily bread or largely idealized versions for funerary contexts. Nevertheless, they offer a fascinating glimpse into the diversity of bread forms. Despite the variation in shapes, one thing remains constant: the inherent grittiness of the flour. No amount of artistic shaping could remove the abrasive particles embedded within the dough. So now, whether it was a humble disc or an elaborate offering, that telltale crunch would always be present. You can almost smell the raw dough, a mix of earthy grain and the faint, tangy aroma of fermentation, as the future loaves take their distinctive, ancient forms, awaiting their fiery transformation. With the dough meticulously shaped, it's time for the transformative power of heat. You are now about to explore baking's earliest ovens, witnessing the surprisingly varied and often simple clay ovens used for baking, which were essentially heated pits or domes. Forget your modern kitchen appliances with their precise temperature controls. This was an art of fire and earth. The most common baking setup you'd observe would be variations of the Tanner or Tabbouleh oven, still seen in some traditional societies today. These were typically made of thick, insulating clay, often mixed with straw for strength, shaped into a large, upright cylinder or a domed structure. A fire would be built inside the oven, heating its walls to an incredibly high temperature. You can almost feel the intense radiated heat emanating from the glowing interior, the air shimmering with the thermal energy. Once the walls were scorching hot, the embers and ash would be raked out, leaving behind a clean, incredibly hot baking surface. This simple yet effective design for baking is a mainstream historical fact, foundational to ancient culinary practices. You might also see less sophisticated methods. For the humblest of homes, Baking might occur in a simple pit dug in the ground, lined with stones and heated with a fire. Once hot, the dough would be placed directly on the hot stones, or even covered with hot ashes and earth, relying on residual heat to cook. This highlights the ingenuity born of necessity, adapting readily available materials for essential tasks. The shaped loaves, whether flat discs or intricate forms, would then be carefully placed inside these hot ovens. For the cylindrical ovens, flatbreads could be slapped directly onto the hot interior walls, sticking temporarily until they baked and puffed, then peeling off. Other loaves might be placed on clay plates or shards, then slid into the oven's base. The skill lay in judging the temperature by instinct, knowing when the oven was perfectly hot enough to bake the bread through without burning it. A quirky tidbit sometimes, larger, more communal bakeries would have multiple ovens, allowing for continuous production to feed the populace or the vast workforces constructing monuments. You might hear the constant clack of clay shovels moving loaves in and out, and the excited chatter of bakers at work. Historians still argue whether bread was primarily baked in communal ovens or if every household had its own small baking apparatus. However, in the omnipresent scent of baking bread, a warm, inviting aroma mixed with hints of smoke and earth, would have been a comforting presence in ancient Egyptian villages and cities. The very air pulses with the dry heat of the ovens, transforming humble dough into daily sustenance. While the specialized clay ovens were prevalent, especially in larger homes and bakeries, you'd also witness incredibly rudimentary, yet effective, open-air baking techniques. For many ancient Egyptians, particularly in rural areas or during outdoor work, bread was baked directly on hot stones or embers, a method that connects you deeply to humanity's earliest culinary practices. Imagine a simple campfire, or perhaps a small, shallow pit where wood has been burned down to glowing embers. Once the fire has done its work and the ground or stones beneath are searing hot, the ash is often brushed away, leaving a clean, heat-radiating surface. Then, the shaped dough, often flattened into simple discs, is carefully placed directly onto these hot stones or directly onto the hot embers. You can almost hear the soft sizzle as the dough makes contact with the intense heat, a sound of immediate transformation. This method, while seemingly primitive, works by conducting heat directly into the dough, cooking it from the bottom up. For the top to cook, sometimes hot ash or even more embers would be carefully piled onto the dough itself, creating a primitive top-down heating effect. Other times, the intense ambient heat radiating from the ground and fire would be enough. This direct contact with hot surfaces and embers is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing a foundational method of bread baking across many ancient cultures. It's a testament to their resourcefulness, using whatever was at hand to cook their essential food. The speed of this baking could vary. Flatbreads would cook relatively quickly, puffing up and browning in a matter of minutes. Thicker loaves would require more careful management of the heat, perhaps being moved around to ensure even cooking. You might see a baker using a stick or a simple wooden paddle to flip the bread or adjust its position, their hands skillfully avoiding the intense heat. A quirky tidbit: this direct contact with embers and hot surfaces inevitably meant that the finished bread would often have bits of ash clinging to its crust, further adding to the grittiness. It also imparted a distinct smoky flavor, a taste that would have been completely normal to the ancient palate. Historians still argue whether this open-air baking was primarily a utilitarian method for travelers or field workers, or if it was a common daily practice for many households due to its simplicity and low cost. But the image of bread baking directly under the open sky, infused with the essence of fire and earth, is a powerful reminder of humanity's ancient ingenuity. The air is thick with the tantalizing scent of baking dough and the pervasive, earthy smell of wood smoke. Whether baked in a dedicated clay oven or directly on hot embers, one undeniable characteristic of ancient Egyptian bread was the pervasive presence of Nile and smoke infusion. This wasn't just about cooking the bread, it was about imbuing it with a distinct flavor and an additional layer of natural, if unintended, grit. Imagine the baking process. Even in the most refined of their ovens, direct contact with fire or hot ash was often unavoidable. When loaves were placed directly onto the hot floor of a clay oven after the embers were raked out, some residual ash would inevitably cling to the bottom crust. If the bread was baked in or under hot ashes, as was common in simpler, open-air methods, the contact was even more direct and extensive. You can almost visualize the fine gray powder adhering to the golden brown surface of a freshly baked loaf. This subtle yet omnipresent ash and smoke infusion is a mainstream historical fact of ancient bread baking, shaping its texture and flavor profile. The smoke, too, played its part. As wood or dried dung, a common fuel source in ancient Egypt, burned, the smoke filled the baking chamber or hovered over the open fire. This smoke would subtly permeate the dough as it baked, imparting a distinct smoky flavor to the finished bread. For the ancient Egyptians, this smoky tang wouldn't have been unusual. It was simply part of the expected taste of their daily bread, much like the smell of toast is for us today. It's hard to imagine, but for them, freshly baked probably meant a hint of char and a whisper of smoke. This ash and smoke was, while adding flavor, also contributed to the overall grittiness. Ash is, after all, a fine particulate matter. When consumed, it would add to the abrasive load on their teeth, combining with the sand from the fields and the pulverized stone from the querns. You might imagine brushing off a particularly dark patch, only to find the gritty residue still there, clinging stubbornly. A quirky tidbit: some scholars suggest that the smoky flavor was so ingrained in their palate that bread baked without it might have seemed bland or wrong to an ancient Egyptian. It was less a defect and more a defining characteristic. Historians still argue whether different types of wood or fuel like palm fronds versus acacia wood imparted distinct flavor profiles to the bread, adding regional variations to the taste. But the undeniable truth is that every bite of ancient Egyptian bread was a multisensory experience, combining the earthy taste of grain, the tang of fermentation, and the subtle, inescapable nuances of fire, ash, and smoke. The air, even now, carries the ghost of that ancient bakery, a warm, smoky, slightly acrid scent. With the bread finally baked, you now witness its physical manifestation, the crumbly texture that was so characteristic of ancient Egyptian bread. This wasn't your soft, squishy modern white bread, nor was it even a dense, chewy sourdough. This was something altogether different, largely a direct consequence of the ingredients and the primitive milling process. Imagine breaking open a freshly baked loaf. You wouldn't find a network of delicate, airy pockets. Instead, you'd encounter a coarse, dense interior, prone to crumbling rather than tearing cleanly. The individual particles of flour, having been ground relatively coarsely on the saddle querns, retained more of their original shape and didn't develop the finely meshed gluten structure that modern, finely milled flour allows. This coarser grind meant less elasticity and more brittleness in the final product. This characteristic coarse and crumbly texture is a mainstream historical fact, defining the eating experience of bread for millennia. And of course, there was the grit. Every single crumb would contain those tiny, abrasive particles of sand from the fields and pulverized stone from the querns, along with the occasional speck of ash. When you bit into it, you wouldn't just hear the gentle tearing of bread, you'd feel a distinct, unmistakable crunch. It was a texture that constantly reminded you of the journey the grain had taken from the earth to your mouth, a perpetual, low-level abrasive assault on your teeth. You can almost feel the unpleasant sensation on your own molars, a stark contrast to the soft breads we're accustomed to. The presence of the bran and germ, which remained largely intact due to the coarse milling, also contributed to the density and crumbly nature of the bread. While these components added nutritional value, they also interfered with the smooth development of the gluten network, leading to a less cohesive crumb structure. It was whole grain, all right, but not in the pleasant, chewy way you might imagine from a modern artisanal loaf. A quirky tidbit to make the bread more palatable or easier to eat. Some ancient Egyptians might have dipped it in water, oil, or a thin stew, softening it slightly before consumption. This also would have helped to lubricate the gritty particles, making them less damaging. Historians still argue whether the perceived freshness of bread was measured by its warmth and softness briefly, after baking, or if the inherent grittiness was simply a constant, unchanging factor in their culinary experience. But the image of a loaf that crumbles easily in the hand, releasing its telltale gritty secret with every bite, leaves a lasting impression of the practical realities of their daily diet. The air, even now, seems to hold the ghost of that ancient texture, a dry, slightly coarse memory. You've now tasted, metaphorically, the coarse, crumbly, and undeniably gritty nature of ancient Egyptian bread. The inescapable consequence of this daily diet, laden with abrasive particles, was the severe and widespread sans dental toll. Imagine living your entire life with a constant, low-grade abrasion happening inside your mouth with every meal. This wasn't just about minor discomfort. It led to profound and often debilitating dental issues. As you chew the sand-laden bread, those tiny, sharp fragments of stone and grit act like sandpaper, relentlessly grinding down the enamel of your teeth. Over years of consumption, this wears away the protective outer layer, exposing the softer dentin underneath. The molars, the workhorses of chewing, would show the most significant wear, often flattened and polished smooth by the constant friction. This severe dental wear caused by the constant ingestion of abrasive sand particles is a mainstream historical fact, widely documented in archaeological findings. The problems didn't stop there. Once the enamel was gone, the dentin became exposed, making teeth incredibly sensitive to hot and cold. Furthermore, the constant abrasion could lead to cracks, chips, and even fractures in the teeth. More critically, the exposed dentin and pulp, the innermost part of the tooth containing nerves and blood vessels, became highly susceptible to infection. You can imagine the excruciating pain of a dental abscess in a world with no dentists and no painkillers beyond natural remedies. Abscesses could lead to facial swelling, systemic infections, and, in severe cases, even death. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Egyptian skulls show evidence of attempts to relieve the pain of dental abscesses by drilling small holes into the jawbone to drain pus. A rudimentary form of ancient oral surgery. You might wince at the thought. Historians still argue whether the dental health of the elite, who might have eaten slightly finer bread or more varied diets, was significantly better than that of the common people. However, even royal mummies show considerable dental wear, proving that no one was entirely immune to the gritty curse. You feel a profound sympathy for these ancient people, their daily sustenance inadvertently inflicting lifelong pain and suffering. The very thought of their meals makes your own teeth feel sensitive. The grim reality of sans dental toll isn't just a hypothesis. It's a conclusion strongly supported by forensic evidence unearthed from ancient burial sites. You are now looking at the compelling evidence in mummies. Learning how paleopathologists definitively identified dental issues linked to sand-laden diets in these remarkably preserved human remains. Imagine a specialized laboratory, far removed from the dusty fields of ancient Egypt, where modern scientists meticulously examine ancient bones and mummified bodies. When they study the skulls of ancient Egyptians, particularly the jaws and teeth, a consistent and striking pattern emerges. The teeth often exhibit extreme degrees of attrition, which is the term for tooth wear caused by tooth-on-tooth grinding, or in this case, by abrasive particles introduced through the diet. You would see molars and premolars, those large chewing teeth, worn down sometimes to mere stubs, their crowns flattened and polished smooth, often with the dark, underlying dentin exposed. This distinct pattern of severe dental wear is a mainstream historical fact, a hallmark finding in virtually all ancient Egyptian skeletal remains. Paleopathologists use various techniques to analyze this wear. They might measure the angle of the worn surfaces or even use microscopes to examine the microscopic scratches and patterns on the tooth enamel and dentin. These analyses consistently point to a diet rich in abrasive particles. They can distinguish this type of wear from other forms, like cavities, though cavities were also present, albeit less common than today due to lower sugar intake or even from intentional tooth modification. A quirky tidbit sometimes. The roots of the teeth themselves are exposed due to the extreme wear. And in some cases, abscesses, pus-filled infections around the tooth roots are clearly visible in the jawbone, manifesting as telltale holes or lesions. This provides direct evidence of the painful infections that resulted from the compromised teeth. You might even see evidence of bone loss in the jaw, a result of the body trying to fight off chronic infection. Historians still argue about the exact prevalence of different dental diseases in various social strata, but the overall picture of poor dental health due to diet is undeniable. The mummies, in their silent repose, tell a vivid story of daily discomfort and suffering, their very teeth bearing witness to the gritty reality of their bread. The air in this imagined laboratory is clean and sterile, a stark contrast to the dust of ancient times. Yet the evidence speaks volumes. Having uncovered the brutal dental reality, let's now consider the unparalleled importance of bread as a staple food. In ancient Egypt, despite its grittiness and its dental toll, bread was not merely a part of their diet. It was the bedrock, the very foundation of sustenance for all social classes, from the humblest peasant to the mighty pharaoh. Imagine waking up in ancient Egypt. Your first thought, and probably your last thought of the day, would revolve around bread. It was consumed at every meal, often comprising the vast majority of caloric intake. For the common laborer, a diet might consist of little more than bread, washed down with beer which, as you'll remember, shares a symbiotic relationship with bread production. You wouldn't just have a slice of bread, you would likely consume several hefty loaves a day. This irreplaceable role in the daily diet of all social classes is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the sheer dependency on this one food item. Even the wealthy, while enjoying a more varied diet including meat, vegetables, and fruits, still consume significant quantities of bread. Their bread might have been made from finer flour, though still gritty by our standards, perhaps with added ingredients like honey, dates, or spices for flavor, and sometimes baked into more elaborate shapes. But bread, in some form, remained central to their meals. It was a universal equalizer, a food that transcended social barriers, even as its quality might vary. Think about the sheer logistics of it. Feeding millions of people day in and day out required a massive, consistent production of grain and bread. This wasn't just about individual sustenance. It was about national security and social stability. A bad harvest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis that could lead to widespread famine and unrest. You can almost feel the collective breath held during harvest season, the anxiety tied to the success of the crops. A quirky tidbit: bread was so fundamental that the common Egyptian greeting, often translated as, "How are you?" literally meant something closer to, "How is your bread?" or "Do you have bread?" This underscores just how intrinsically linked bread was to well-being and life itself. Historians still argue about the exact daily caloric intake from bread for different professions, but estimates suggest it was substantial, forming the bulk of their energy needs. The pervasive, comforting scent of baking bread would have been a constant backdrop to life in ancient Egypt, a reminder of survival and continuity. Beyond its fundamental role as sustenance, bread in ancient Egypt held a far deeper significance. Imbued with profound spiritual and ritualistic meanings, you're now delving into bread's symbolic meanings, understanding that it was not just food for the body, but also for the soul, and a crucial element in their beliefs about life, death, and the divine. Imagine the daily act of baking or eating bread not merely as a chore or a meal, but as a sacred communion. Bread was considered a gift from the gods, specifically from Osiris, the god of agriculture, fertility, and the afterlife, who was believed to have taught humanity how to cultivate grain. Each loaf, therefore, carried a divine blessing. This spiritual and ritualistic significance of bread is a mainstream historical fact, deeply interwoven with ancient Egyptian religious practices. You would see bread playing a central role in temple offerings. Piles of freshly baked loaves were presented to the gods on altars, a symbolic act of returning the bounty received from the divine realm. These offerings were not just for the major deities. Even deceased ancestors were believed to require sustenance in the afterlife, and bread was consistently placed in tombs as funerary provisions. Imagine walking into a tomb and seeing rows of clay replicas of bread loaves, or even actual mummified bread, placed there to nourish the deceased on their journey through the underworld. A quirky tidbit: specific types of bread, sometimes shaped into particular forms or made with special ingredients, were reserved for certain religious festivals or cultic practices. For example, some loaves might have been made with unusual herbs or even symbolic colors. You might even hear priests chanting as they offered bread, consecrating it before placing it before a deity's statue. Historians still argue whether the consumption of these ritual breads by worshippers or priests after the offerings had been made. A practice known as reversion of offerings was seen as a literal sharing of food with the gods, or a symbolic act of spiritual sustenance. Regardless, the bread served as a tangible link between the human and divine realms, a constant reminder of the gods' benevolence and humanity's dependence. The very air seems to hum with the sacred presence of bread, a silent prayer embedded in every loaf. Having explored the spiritual depth of bread, let's now uncover another fascinating and deeply intertwined aspect of ancient Egyptian daily life: the brewing's bread connection. You'll discover that bread wasn't just eaten, it was also a foundational ingredient for their ubiquitous beverage, beer. Imagine a world where your main drink is essentially liquid bread, and the two are almost inseparable in production. This symbiotic relationship is a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptian beer was not the clear, fizzy lager you might enjoy today. It was thick, nutritious, and somewhat cloudy, more like a gruel or a thin porridge. And the secret to its production lay in bread. You observe bakers deliberately making specific types of lightly baked bread, often described as beer bread. These loaves were often unleavened or only slightly leavened, sometimes underbaked to ensure they remained somewhat moist in the center. They were usually made from barley, a grain known for its high sugar content when fermented. These specially prepared bread loaves weren't meant for eating. Instead, they were crumbled into large vats, water, and sometimes dates or other fruits for added sweetness and fermentation would be added to this crumbled bread. This mixture would then be left to ferment. The natural yeast present in the air, or introduced from a previous batch, remember that quirky tidbit about shared yeast, would quickly get to work, converting the starches and sugars from the bread into alcohol and carbon dioxide. You can almost smell the tangy, yeasty aroma of the fermenting mash, a pungent scent that would have been common in ancient breweries. The bread acted as both the primary source of fermentable sugars and as a natural filter or substrate for the yeast. It was an incredibly efficient, if somewhat crude, way to produce a nutritious, safe-to-drink beverage in a world where clean water could be scarce. Beer wasn't just a leisure drink, it was a staple, providing calories and essential nutrients, and often safer to consume than raw river water. You might even see laborers being paid in rations of both bread and beer, their liquid calories just as vital as their solid ones. A quirky tidbit: some scholars believe that the first beers might have been accidental discoveries, perhaps from a forgotten batch of bread dough that got wet and fermented naturally. It's the kind of happy accident that fundamentally changes a civilization. Historians still argue about the exact methods and ingredients for various types of beer, whether some were stronger, sweeter, or made with different grains for different occasions. But the fundamental link between the baker's craft and the brewer's art is undeniable, highlighting the ingenuity of a people who mastered extracting sustenance from their core agricultural products in multiple forms. The air, even now, carries the complex yeasty scent of fermentation, a testament to the intertwined lives of bread and beer. Beyond the basic gritty staple. Ancient Egypt was a land of surprising culinary nuance, even when it came to their most fundamental food. You are now exploring the variations in bread types, discovering that not all loaves were created equal, ranging from the coarse daily fare of the common folk to finer loaves reserved for special occasions or the tables of the elite. Imagine the bustling marketplace or a temple kitchen. You wouldn't just see one type of bread. The most common, as you've already experienced, would be the coarse, dense, and gritty loaves made from emmer wheat or barley, baked simply, often flat or in basic rounds. This was the workhorse bread, the everyday sustenance that fueled the vast majority of the population. Its texture and flavor, while likely monotonous to our modern palates, were comforting and familiar to them. This existence of different bread qualities and types, reflecting social status and occasion, is a mainstream historical fact, present in many ancient societies. However, for those with more resources, or for ceremonial purposes, bread could become significantly more refined. You might encounter loaves made from higher quality emmer, perhaps even a variety of wheat that was slightly easier to mill, resulting in a somewhat finer, though still not smooth, flour. These might have been more carefully sifted, though still far from perfectly clean, to remove larger impurities. Then there were the additions. Imagine loaves enriched with honey, giving them a subtle sweetness and a richer crust. Dates, a plentiful crop in Egypt, could be chopped and kneaded into the dough, adding natural sugars and moisture. Spices, though perhaps less common than in later periods, might have been incorporated for aromatic qualities, particularly for temple offerings or elite consumption. You might also see loaves made with milk or fat, producing a softer texture and richer flavor, a true luxury. These finer breads would often be baked in molds or given more elaborate shapes, as you saw earlier, marking them as distinct from the common fare. A quirky tidbit, some analyses of ancient bread remains show evidence of herbs or even fermented fruit pulp being added, suggesting experimental and varied flavor profiles beyond just grain and water. You might imagine a baker in a wealthy household meticulously preparing a special perfumed loaf for a feast. Historians still argue how frequently these finer breads were consumed by the elite, whether they were a daily luxury or reserved for very specific events. But the diversity of bread types reflects a nuanced culinary landscape, even within the confines of their simple technology, and offers a glimpse into the social hierarchy evident even in their daily sustenance. The air here smells not just of plain bread, but of subtle sweetness, perhaps a hint of spice, hinting at a broader range of ancient flavors. Stepping back from the individual loaf, you gain a new perspective on the grand scale of ancient Egyptian society. It becomes clear that bread wasn't just individual sustenance, it was the essential fuel for monumental undertakings. You're now grasping how bread, in its vast quantities, provided the very energy for the workforce sustenance that powered their incredible achievements, particularly the construction of those colossal pyramids and magnificent temples. Imagine tens of thousands of laborers working under the scorching sun, quarrying massive stones, dragging them across the desert, and meticulously placing them to form structures that defy time. This wasn't work that could be done on an empty stomach. Each worker required a consistent, reliable supply of calories and nutrients to maintain their strength and endurance, and the primary source of those calories was bread. This crucial role of bread in fueling the immense labor forces behind monumental construction projects is a mainstream historical fact, central to understanding how such grand feats were accomplished. You would see daily rations being distributed at the construction sites, vast quantities of bread, often accompanied by beer and perhaps some onions or dried fish. These rations weren't just a gesture, they were a calculated provision, ensuring the workforce had the energy to continue their grueling tasks. The organization required to consistently provide these enormous quantities of food for armies of workers speaks to the incredible logistical capabilities of the ancient Egyptian state. Imagine the bakeries working day and night, producing thousands upon thousands of loaves to meet this insatiable demand. A quirky tidbit, Archaeological excavations at sites like the Workmen's Village near the Giza pyramids have unearthed remnants of large-scale bakeries, complete with multiple ovens and grinding facilities, specifically designed to churn out bread for the pyramid builders. You can almost hear the steady rhythm of their work, the constant activity necessary to keep the human engines running. Historians still argue about the precise caloric content of these daily rations and whether they were always sufficient to prevent malnutrition, especially during periods of intense labor or food scarcity. But the sheer volume of bread required underscores its function as the ultimate energy source, a tangible link between the daily grind of the baker and the towering majesty of the monuments. The air, even now, carries the faint, dry scent of dust and exertion, mixed with the ever-present aroma of coarse, baking bread, the silent fuel of empires. Beyond its role as physical sustenance and spiritual symbol, bread was an economic powerhouse in ancient Egypt. You are now grasping why bread's economic value. Its function not just as food, but as a primary form of payment and a critical component of their entire economy. It was, in many ways, the original hard currency of the Nile. Imagine a world without coinage, where the concept of money as we understand it simply didn't exist for the common person. Instead, wealth and transactions were measured in tangible goods, and chief among these was grain, and by extension, bread, your wages for a day's labor. Whether you were a farmer, a scribe, a craftsman, or even a soldier, would often be paid in a specified quantity of grain or bread rations. You might receive a certain number of loaves or measures of grain as your daily, weekly, or monthly income. This function of bread as a form of payment and a critical component of the economy is a mainstream historical fact, foundational to their command economy. Think about a marketplace in ancient Egypt. While direct bartering of goods was common, grain and bread served as the ultimate baseline for value. If you wanted to trade a pot for some linen, the value of both items would often be expressed in terms of how much grain or bread they were worth. Surplus grain, stored in vast granaries, represented the wealth of the state, the temples, and individual landowners. It was a tangible asset, easily understood and universally accepted. This system meant that controlling the grain supply was paramount to political power. The pharaoh, through his administration, managed the vast granaries, ensuring distribution to officials, laborers, and the military. It was a centralized system of immense power and responsibility. You can almost feel the quiet power emanating from those filled granaries, the very pulse of the economy contained within their mud brick walls. A quirky tidbit: legal documents and administrative texts from ancient Egypt frequently detail payments and debts in terms of grain or bread. These records provide fascinating insights into their sophisticated accounting systems, all based around this agricultural commodity. You might see scribes meticulously calculating bread rations for a workforce, their reed pens scratching on papyrus. Historians still argue about the precise exchange rates between different goods when measured in grain, and how fluctuations in harvest might have impacted social stability and the value of labor. But the fundamental truth remains: bread was not just eaten, it was earned, traded, and accumulated, the very engine of their ancient economy. The air, even now, carries the subtle scent of stored grain, a quiet testament to its enduring economic might. Having seen bread's overarching economic and societal impact, let's now turn our attention to the individuals dedicated to its production. You are now observing the baker's craft, witnessing the skilled artisans who toiled to transform grain into the daily sustenance of millions. Baking was not merely a domestic chore for many, it was a respected and essential profession. Imagine the bustling atmosphere of a large, state-run or temple bakery. Here, the production of bread was an industrial-scale operation for its time. You see specialized teams. Some women might be tirelessly grinding grain on the saddle querns, their rhythmic movements a constant backdrop. Others would be responsible for mixing the dough in large troughs, their hands strong and practiced. Then come the shapers, quickly molding the dough into various forms, their fingers deft and efficient. Finally, the oven masters, skilled in managing the intense heat of the clay ovens, ensuring each loaf was perfectly baked. This specialized division of labor and the recognition of baking as a skilled craft is a mainstream historical fact, essential for sustaining large populations. The baker's life was one of relentless work, often in hot, dusty, and smoky environments. Their hands would be calloused and strong, their bodies accustomed to the physical demands of kneading, lifting, and tending to fires. They needed an intuitive understanding of the ingredients, how the humidity affected the dough, how hot the oven needed to be, and when the fermentation was just right. It was a craft passed down through generations, often within families. You can almost feel the heat emanating from the ovens, smell the pervasive aroma of baking bread, and sense the camaraderie and efficiency born of shared labor. A quirky tidbit: some tomb paintings depict bakers with remarkable attention to detail, showing their tools, their techniques, and the various stages of bread making, suggesting a pride in their profession. You might even see a baker, smudged with flour and ash, wiping sweat from their brow, a silent testament to their dedication. Historians still argue about the social status of bakers, whether they were considered common laborers or held a slightly elevated position due to their crucial contribution to society's well-being. But there's no doubt that their role was indispensable. Without the dedication and skill of these artisans, the entire ancient Egyptian edifice, from its massive workforce to its elaborate religious rituals, would simply crumble. The very air seems to hum with the diligent activity of the ancient bakery, a testament to the enduring human need to create sustenance. As our journey through ancient Egyptian bread making draws to a close, you might wonder if any of these ancient practices still resonate today. Indeed, you'll find that there are fascinating and modern echoes of ancient bread, or subtle yet enduring legacies of their techniques that can still be glimpsed in our contemporary world. Imagine walking into an artisanal bakery today. While the machinery is vastly different, the core principles remain the same: flour, water, yeast, often a cultivated strain, but still descended from wild yeasts, salt, and heat. The fundamental chemical and biological processes of mixing, kneading, and fermenting dough haven't changed in millennia. This enduring legacy of ancient bread-making techniques and their subtle presence today is a mainstream historical fact, connecting us directly to our culinary past. Consider traditional flatbreads found across the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia. Foods like pita, lavash, or various regional flatbreads. Many of these are still baked in dome-shaped clay ovens, similar in principle to the ancient Egyptian tabbouleh, or even directly on hot surfaces. You can almost see the ancient baker in the swift, practiced movements of a modern artisan, slapping dough onto the inside of a hot tannour. The characteristic slight char, the satisfying chewiness, and the simple perfection of these breads carry echoes of their ancient ancestors. Even the concept of sourdough, with its reliance on a starter passed down and maintained, is a direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian practice of saving a piece of fermented dough to leaven the next batch. Remember that quirky tidbit: that living culture, sustained for days or weeks, creates a distinctive tangy flavor, a taste that might be remarkably similar to what ancient Egyptians experienced with their daily loaves. It's a taste of history, alive and bubbling in a modern kitchen. A quirky tidbit: while modern milling is vastly superior, some health-conscious consumers today seek out stone-ground flours, valuing the coarser texture and the retention of more bran and germ. While these modern stone mills are much more refined than the ancient saddlequerns, they are, in a very distant way, a nod to the ancient grinding process. Historians still argue whether the exact flavor profile of ancient Egyptian bread can ever be truly replicated, given the differences in grain varieties, yeast strains, and environmental factors. But the fundamental elements, the very soul of bread, remain remarkably constant. The air here smells not just of the ancient past, but of freshly baked bread from countless cultures, a timeless aroma. As the sun dips below the horizon in our imagined ancient Egypt, casting long, purple shadows across the Nile-fed fields, we come to the gentle close of our journey. You've witnessed the tireless labor, the ingenious adaptations, and the profound significance of bread in a civilization that rose from the very dust and grit of its land. The story of how ancient Egyptians made bread with sand isn't just a culinary tale, it's a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring connection between people in their most fundamental food source. You now understand that the grit in their bread wasn't a flaw, but an inescapable reality, a physical manifestation of their environment, their tools, and their methods. It was the taste of the Nile's silt, the whispers of the desert wind, and the tireless abrasion of stone on grain, all consumed with every bite. Their very teeth, worn smooth and sometimes painfully infected, bore the silent marks of this daily sustenance. It reminds you that history isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's quite literally gritty. But beyond the grit, you've glimpsed the deeper meanings: bread as currency, bread as divine offering, bread as the fuel for monumental achievements that still stand thousands of years later. It was a food that was sacred, sustaining, and utterly central to their lives. From birth to the journey into the afterlife, their intimate relationship with their food, from the field to the oven, was a cycle of profound dependency and immense gratitude. As the final images of ancient bakeries and sun-drenched fields begin to fade, take a moment to reflect on the quiet power of these stories. The dust, the effort, the subtle crunch. It all paints a vivid picture of a people who, despite facing challenges we can barely imagine, managed to create a civilization of unparalleled grandeur, sustained by the humblest of grains. Their legacy is not just in the pyramids, but in the enduring act of baking bread itself, a ritual that continues in countless forms across the globe to this very day. The sounds of the ancient world, the rhythmic scrunch of the quern, the soft thwack of kneading dough, the sizzle of bread on hot stones, now gently recede. The smells of rich earth, dry grain, wood smoke, and the tangy aroma of fermenting dough begin to soften, becoming fainter, like a distant memory. Imagine those ancient bakers, their day's work done, perhaps sitting by the dying embers of their ovens, sharing a last, gritty loaf as the stars begin to pinpoint the vast, dark sky. The whisper of the wind carries their story, a quiet reminder of lives lived, sustained by the gifts of the Nile and the enduring magic of grain. And now, as the ancient world drifts further into the realm of dreams, let your own thoughts slow, your breathing deepen. Feel the comfortable quiet of your space. The journey is complete, the story's told. Rest easy now, knowing a little more about the tireless hands that fed an empire. Sweet dreams.